Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 17th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I want to apologize for the sort of late posting of this week's episode. You may actually not be getting this on Monday, June 17th. It may be Tuesday, June 18th, where you are. It's been pretty intense week at work and personally, and sometimes I'm late, and I'm so sorry about that, but I promise I have a fascinating show for you. So before we get into the weeds, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way we keep this train on the tracks is by relying on the episodic support from listeners just like you. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. If you're interested in pledging your support, as little or as much as you'd like, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. All right. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with the author of a new book called Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. Nicola Twilley is the co-author of another book, Until Proven Safe: The History and Future of Quarantine. And she's also the co-host of Gastropod, the award-winning and popular podcast that looks at food through the lens of science and history, which is produced as part of the Vox Media podcast network in partnership with Eater. And she's also a frequent contributor to The New Yorker. So without any further ado, here she is, the author of Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, Nicola Twilley. Well, Nikki, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I am excited to talk about your new book, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And as I often do on the show, before we dive into the book itself, I'd love to talk a little bit about you and your work, maybe some of your previous writing, your podcasting, and really just how you got involved in this kind of media landscape. It's such a funny thing now because if somebody asks you, what do you do for a living? How do you describe yourself? What's your title?
Yeah, I usually laugh. Yeah. I mean, honestly, at this point, I guess I'm a writer and a podcaster. That's what I say.
Okay.
And fortunately, nowadays, you don't have to then explain what a podcast is. There was a
Right.
time where you did.
Yeah.
But yeah, writer and podcaster. And the podcasting thing I never saw coming, but you know, I was on a writing fellowship, Michael Pollan's writing fellowship, food and farming writing fellowship at UC Berkeley. And one of my fellows was Cynthia Graber. And we stayed in touch. And she was both a writer and had worked in radio for years. And it's a very long story, but I was having a terrible morning one morning. And she was like, well, I have this thing. I was going to try and get your advice on it. Maybe it's not a good time. And I was like, just send it over. And it was a proposal for a new podcast about food science and history. And I looked at it and I was like, well, you need a co-host. And it should be me. And I feel like it was a little out of character. It's not like I'm some shy retiring person, but this was the very take no prisoners version.
Right. It was very bold, very brave.
Yeah. And she said, sure. Yeah, that's a great idea. And so I turned myself into a podcaster really because I was in a bad mood.
And how long do you think it took you to sort of get your legs? It's an interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I was like, well, I listen to podcasts. I already know everything. What could be so hard? And if Cynthia was listening to me right now, she would be laughing her ass off because it's very different. It's just a very different way of storytelling and reporting and using your voice. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know that, but I had to learn it. And yeah, I didn't realize I was going to have to learn it either. So I didn't go in with the mentality of like, oh, I'm going to need to learn a whole new set of skills. So it was a steep curve, but there you go. But also, I think kind of an amazing thing to do because you bring that sort of new way of reporting and thinking about structure and voice and storytelling. You bring it back to your writing, so it's very enriching actually to have to learn those new skills. I just
Mm-hmm.
didn't realize how much hard work it was going to be.
Right. So tell us a little bit about Gastropod for those who don't listen or who are looking for something new to subscribe to.
Yeah, so Gastropod is my pride and joy. It comes out every other week. We look at food through the lens of science and history. That's our tagline, and topics will vary from I don't know what people eat in the Arctic to the history of restaurant acoustics and why restaurants are so loud and the science there. So we do sort of tackle one topic every couple of weeks. We go deep. We interview a bunch of guests. We're making an episode on food allergies right now. Ton of fascinating history and science there. So and sometimes we'll take a topic like that. Sometimes we'll take a single food item, the history and science of the bagel or the donut, or and
Mm,
yeah, we have a lot of fun with it. I it kind of feels like we become subject matter experts on a whole new thing every 2 weeks. That's
right.
my favorite thing because it's always a process of discovery and figuring things out and yeah, learning.
And for a long time, you've been interested in learning, especially with this sort of history and science lens. You've been writing for some time. Has this always been the focus of your career, writing, and then obviously now this new medium?
No, it took me a really long time to figure out what I wanted to do, or rather, what I could do and be
Mhm.
paid to do. Um,
Mhm.
so, I mean, yeah, originally I thought maybe academia might be the path, but I hate being tied down to one discipline.
Mm.
So that really didn't suit me. I did an undergrad. I went and enrolled in a PhD program, and I immediately wanted to change after the master's. And I realized, oh, that's just me. I don't like,
Right.
I don't like this structure. So, I like going deep, but I don't like going ever deeper in a single discipline.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, to the
so
point where they always say what you know at the beginning, you know a little bit about a lot, and by the end of a PhD, you know a whole lot about very little.
Very little.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we need those people. It's just not me. And so then I thought, well, maybe I would. It seemed like people who worked for museums had a lot of fun. They got to, curate exhibitions and events and learn things. So I tried that for a while, and I'm I well, a decade really actually, and I had a lot of fun with some of that too. I got to work on Ben Franklin's 300th birthday celebrations, which was
Oh,
really fun. It was
weird and random and awesome.
very random. I mean, I was living in Philly at the time, so he is
Okay,
like
a
the
less random.
man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and uh, and what was funny about it is because I didn't go to school in the U.S. I didn't grow up here. I'm not. My parents are British, and
Mhm.
so I really hadn't. I didn't know a lot about Benjamin Franklin. I mean, I
Mhm.
hadn't really come across him at all. And so it was this, I kept being like, have you heard of this guy? He is amazing. He developed a whole new alphabet and he
Hilarious.
did this thing with lightning and da da da. And everyone was like, oh my God,
He
we
is a
know.
fascinating guy. I remember watching the Ken Burns documentary about him and learning like, he was such a, uh, culture critic, and also, hilariously, he didn't spend that much time in the US either. Wasn't he
No,
in, like, Paris
Paris and
for a
London.
long
Yeah,
time? Yeah, Paris and
totally.
London, yeah.
And no, he's definitely, I mean, I don't, it's not like I'm a big founding father, stan in general, but I feel like if you had to pick one, he's your man because he's just more fun. I mean, total flirt, but he had a sense of humor. He had a sense of curiosity. He was in touch with fascinating people. He tried his hand at everything. One of the little Easter eggs in Frostbite, my book actually, is Ben Franklin comes up a bunch of times, and it's like my little secret tribute that I thought no one was going to notice, but now I'm telling the whole world.
Well, the whole world doesn't listen to the show, but yes, I agree. The cat's out of the bag.
He electrocuted a turkey as a way of killing it, and that comes up in the chapter on how we have to electrocute our meat carcasses because they cool down too slowly, and so they stiffen up. And so Ben Franklin has a weird shout out, and that's not the only one. There are a couple.
I love that because I was literally about to say it's sort of a far cry from Ben Franklin to like food science and history, but clearly there are threads.
No. He always. I try to work Ben in everywhere. I was writing in a New Yorker article about indoor air pollution, and there's a Ben Franklin quote in there about he was sharing a bed with Alexander Hamilton, which sounds like I'm setting up a comedy situation. Yeah. But they were staying in an inn, and Alexander Hamilton wanted the window closed because he thought they would, catch their death of cold. And Ben Franklin was like, no, the air within is worse for us than the air outside. And so, again, ahead of his time.
Totally. Yeah. It was like so much truth in that. That's fascinating. And I'm curious, as you kind of moved into writing as a career and sort of looking through this lens that you look through, what was it about, or what is it, I should say, about food that speaks to you so much?
Yeah, I wish I could say I arrived at that on my own. But actually, it was my husband who was like, "Why don't you write about food? It combines everything you love. You get to write about design and art and science and history and sensory things and other species and what they do. Like all of those, everything is sort of that can be." Cause I wanted to find something that was a productive constraint. You know what I mean? Like something that sort of kept my attention focused enough. But being the kind of person I am, I was like, I hate all constraints. Everything is too constraining. So I was really wrestling with what I would write about. And he was like, food. It's obviously food. So that's really, and I mean, I love food, but it's not like I was the world's greatest cook or had a background in it at all. It just was something that allowed me to, it's a lens to, it allowed me to go in all these different directions while still feeling kind of coherent.
It's fascinating, even just the process that you described about, looking for sort of a helpful constraint, but also not wanting to be constrained. I, I've long thought that that is so necessary for kind of human ingenuity and human creativity, is that when there's no constraints whatsoever, it's sort of like nothing is real anymore, Like I often think about these psychological tests for creativity, which is like the hardest construct in the world to measure. And I remember talking about this with some colleagues, and it's like you give a kid a pile of paper clips and you say, what can you make with this? And, yeah, anybody can go like, look, it's an airplane, but it's like, no, that's a pile of paper clips. You got to make it into an airplane. And so I often think about that, like when there are rules, even if they're minimal, even if they're wiggly, when there's something imposed upon you and now you have to operate within that constraint, it can guide so much fascinating creativity.
100%. I think it's the key. And yet I was having a very hard time applying it to myself. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, my advice is, find a great husband who will do that for you or partner.
I love it. And so food, right? Okay, he's like, food is it. This is going to be the thing. And then from food, you got to refrigeration. And so how did that transition or that, I don't want to call it a leap, but that evolution take place?
Yeah, I mean, there's many fascinating topics within food. Obviously, that's
Right.
why. I mean, we come up with a new episode every 2 weeks for Gastropod. But what was happening at the time, and this gives you a sense of how long I've been working on this book, was that everyone was talking about farm to table. So this is the very early 2010s. And, Michael Pollan, Eric Schlosser, there's just been Alice Waters, this whole kind of national dialogue about farm to table. And I don't know if you remember it. That was sort of in the air at the time.
Oh yeah,
And
like every new restaurant was a farm to table restaurant and it was very chic. Yes,
it
I
was very
definitely.
chic. It was everywhere. And a lot of people were talking and writing about what was happening on farms. I mentioned Michael Pollan. I mean, that's the classic example of like, oh wow, this is how our food is raised, you know?
Right.
And
Mhm.
and so that was all very inspiring and fascinating to me. But being the kind of person that I am, I was like, well, what about the two? Uh, you know, there's farm, there's table, there's
Yeah.
a word in here that's, what's happening in between. And so I started looking into that, thinking, okay, maybe there's some interesting mileage to be gotten out of sort of the logic of logistics or things like that. And then I realized, oh, wow, we have built this whole mostly invisible network of synthetic winter for our food to live in. And I need to go visit these places and see what they look like. And so that's how that happened.
Oh, I love that. And it's a whole fascinating, you're right, like parallel world that we talk about like, oh, you don't want to see how the sausage is made. Like there's this whole like system in place for so many aspects of our lives, especially as they relate to, I think, creature comforts, to ease of living that we take for granted very often in the West or in higher income countries, and just in general, we take for granted that there's almost a magic, but really that's a lot of like blood, sweat, and tears. There's a second facet to this, which I want to dive into weirdly first and then get into some of the brass tacks, which is I live in a world of science and skepticism. I live in an academic world. But I also I work as a clinical psychologist, and so I also live in the real world where people are, right? People with thoughts and feelings and beliefs and all of those things. Um, and I'm very constructivist in my approach, and I want to understand where people are coming from, yada, yada. I also live in Los Angeles. And living in Los Angeles, there's a lot of woo. And it's fascinating to me, this thing that I notice a lot when it comes to science and technology, especially as it relates to our food and maybe our medicine also to some extent. But food, it feels like it takes the brunt of it, where there's an innate fear and an innate anti technological um, uh, kind of approach that really falls victim to the quote naturalistic fallacy, right? That if we do anything to adulterate, if we do anything to alter, if we preserve, if we freeze, if we refrigerate, somehow we are nutritionally depriving ourselves and some as if being able to make food last longer is not a boon for the planet. And so I'm super curious, even before we get into some of the history about that balance and that investigation that you made into the good, the bad, the ugly, and the fear and the excitement and the techno optimism and some of the technophobia about not just refrigeration, but yeah, preserving our food.
That's such a great question. So, yeah, I mean, first of all, preserving food is one of the central activities of humanity for all of human history. I mean, that, along with sort of running away from things that wanted to eat us and, reproducing and so on, possibly making the odd cave painting here and there, we tried to make our food last, to store it, to hoard it. There's evidence of, Paleolithic people using snow pits to preserve their mammoth, haul, putting bones in caves to save the bone marrow for later. So this idea that we could that trying to preserve food is somehow unnatural is, it's at the core of humanity. It's there's this amazing quote by an Italian author that says, "Preserving food is anxiety in its purest form." But I think it's one of our most pressing concerns throughout history. A vast amount of human ingenuity has been devoted to it. So, we're basically been fighting this millennia-long interspecies war with the microbes and fungi that want to eat our food before we can. And so, we develop smoking and drying, and then also these very sophisticated methods like fermentation. And so refrigeration is just just the sort of one of the latest, not even the end of the ways that we will figure out how to do that. What's interesting is, I think there's this often very black and white attitude toward food, like good or bad. Is
Good
it
or
one or
bad,
the other?
exactly. Yeah,
Healthy or
healthy
not?
or unhealthy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I've talked about this book. I'm a one-woman monologue about this book, to be honest. But I've been talking about it for nearly a decade at this point, because that's how long I've been working on it. And people always say, "Oh, so you're against refrigeration then? Like, is my fridge bad? Should I get rid of my..." And I'm just like, no, I'm not about to get rid of my fridge. Absolutely not. The point is, refrigeration is a technology. We implemented it in a certain way. Isn't it time to have a look at the food system that has created and whether we would like to optimize for something else instead? Could we do better? It has costs as well as benefits. So can we do anything about those costs? And so, yeah, I think, it's not like, oh, I'm against refrigeration. I think it's just that it's so ubiquitous and built into our food system now and essentially invisible that people don't think of it as a thing that you can question or imagine alternatives to. And yet it's really recent and it really has had huge impacts on everything from, what we eat to where it's grown to how good it is for us and the planet. And so why not take a look at that?
It's true. We don't often think not just about the downstream effects, but also about the ones that occur then upstream as a part of a feedback loop. When we have a sort of disruptive technology like that we end up building systems to match the technology as opposed to the technology continuing to adapt to our systems. And I think even further than that, this sort of black and white thinking, this good versus bad thinking, I worry that it underlies a lot of kind of dangerous public health decisions that I mean, again, I'm biased because I live in Los Angeles and I have friends who I think make terrible decisions for their health out of fear of kind of modern science. And so, let's say somebody is really grappling ethically with factory farming, which is a completely legitimate.
You should be,
And
yes, in
yeah,
fact.
exactly, they should be. And in the process of that, they become caught up in a series of negotiations that end with a full throwing out of the baby with the bathwater, where now, like, I have a friend who literally drinks raw milk. And I'm like, no, let's not do that.
Right.
And that's the part where it's that, like, the extremes, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
And now pasteurization is evil, and now all of these other things are evil, and now the only way to do this in an ethical way is to do it actually in a way that goes back to a public health crisis when people were dying of very preventable infectious diseases.
Right. Right. It's, I think it is, it's tough, like holding that nuance in your mind and not having a like right or wrong answer to things, and having life be the sort of messy business of compromise that it is, and where you really do have to make context dependent decisions all the time, which is very tiring. I can understand why you just sort of, yeah, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as you say. But it's, I mean, yeah, I hope anyone who reads this book or listens to Gastropod will understand that it's never yes or no. I mean, to be honest, it's no with factory farmed food, but it's never it's never this sort of black and white discussion, and there are reasons why things happen, and the trick is to interrogate those and see what you think about them and whether you support them, and make decisions accordingly.
Right. And so thinking about something as, like you said, ubiquitous as refrigeration, I think most of the people right now listening to this show have one refrigerator at least in their home. Um, if not in their home, at their place of business. It's something that you don't think about until it breaks, um, or until something goes wrong with it. But this machine, this one of our largest machines in our homes, and of course beyond the home in the food supply chain, in different consumer facing restaurants and shops, all over the place. These machines contribute to a pretty big existential crisis that we're all facing, don't they?
Right. Yes. The sad irony of the fact that the the more artificial winter we build, the less actual winter we get. It's basically, you know, there's no getting around it. The energy and, perhaps even more significantly, the chemicals we use in refrigerating machines, they're called refrigerants. Those combined make refrigeration one of the bigger causes of global warming, climate change, and one of the fastest growing ones too. Because the thing you also have to remember is that while the United States has this, enormous cold chain, that by the way is still expanding, actually at a very rapid rate, um, due to shifts in how we consume food. The sort of delivery world has led to the construction of a vast number of new refrigerated warehouses, as has the expansion of the Panama Canal. Well, so, shifts in the logistics landscape. But so the US one is already gigantic, still growing. Much of the I guess what we could call the developing world, much of that doesn't have any cold chain at all, and they're planning to build it. And so if that happens, as currently it is, I mean, one expert told me, well, if everyone has a US style cold chain, there won't be a harvest to put in it because climate change will have made sure of that. So it is an existential dilemma. People point out, and correctly, that the cold chain prevents a lot of food waste. And food waste is a huge cause of carbon emissions, climate change emissions. It's one of the biggest. The US, China, and then if global food waste was a country, it would be third. The problem there with that argument is that refrigeration doesn't prevent food waste on the way from the farm to the store, but it actually just seems to shift where that food waste takes place, because the United States, the food waste is all happening at the consumer level. So it used to be a third of food was wasted, went bad before it even reached the store. Now it's, we throw away a third of all food. We buy it and we throw it away, or restaurants throw it away, or the supermarket throws it away. So it's just shifted where that waste happens. It hasn't prevented it.
Right. So this sort of almost marketing of mitigation of food waste is more, to me, sounds like a post hoc reasoning than something that was a priori built in to trying to mitigate food waste, which
Yeah,
I may be wrong, but so much of that, doesn't it just have to do with like planning?
the planning how like so I mean two things in response
Mhm.
to what you're saying. First of all, when refrigeration really got started in the US, actually preventing food waste was a big part of the
I see.
deal.
Right.
That really was, I mean, the context is, for the first time, there are more there, the cities are really big. People are moving to cities. Cities of above 1 million inhabitants start to be, common. And feeding cities that are that big without a cold chain is really hard. And so
What
there
were
was
they mostly relying on? Just like canning?
well, no, I mean, actually, it's kind of amazing. I mean, the animals kind of were brought to the city to be slaughtered. So,
Oh, okay.
including herding turkeys into cities. You can imagine how, if you've ever tried to herd a flock of birds, how well that went. Some actually lived in the cities. So in London, there were entire dairies filled with milking cows that were kept in basements underneath the Strand. So Central Park used to be full of pigs. It was, I mean, and it was tough. I mean, no, having feeding a city without refrigeration is undoubtedly very tricky. And so that was the primary concern when in the late 1700s there were scientific committees set up to study this problem. Actually, what was fascinating is most of them thought that refrigeration wasn't going to be the answer. There was a big fad for jerked food and like what they thought of as like a jerky, like a dried kind of reconstitutable meat products. There was
Like
a big
astronaut food.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. People tried like various injections and coatings, and so there were a whole lot of. I mean, it was the big scientific question of the day: how shall we preserve enough food for our urban dwellers? So yeah, it was, and it was designed to really solve that problem. What no one anticipated is that once you had this seasonless abundance in stores, well, then consumers would just start throwing it away.
Yeah, that really sounds like it was a tipping point, is going from insecurity and a need to ensure that there is enough to, like you said, an abundance and this kind of embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, and I
And
think this idea psychologically that the refrigerator will keep it good. And so it takes off the part of the anxiety that should be there in your brain about, I have to eat this before it goes bad, because now it's in your fridge. Well, that it seems like a nice, you know, safety net. And then it does go bad because the fridge is not, it doesn't guarantee or immortality. It just prolongs, the window you have to eat something in. So yeah, I think for a lot of people it sort of functions as this clean, cold trash can.
it
But
does. And I think even more than that is the freezer.
yeah,
It's like, oh, it's going to go bad in the fridge. Just throw it in the freezer.
freezer.
It'll never expire in there.
Yeah, yep. So it's an interesting psychological problem. I talked to a bunch of fridge designers for the book, and it's very interesting. They try and tackle this, but consumers don't really care, and supermarkets definitely don't care. People sort of, so they'll introduce a smart fridge that will tell you what's going bad. I mean, they told me they've noticed people really don't care, actually. It's not that it's not, I mean, they feel a sense of guilt, but actually, it's not that, we don't know that things will go bad in our fridge. It's that it allows us to sort of put it out of our minds.
Right. Close the door, not see it, not think
Yeah.
about it.
Hmm. It's in a crisper drawer. It's at the bottom. It's fine.
Yeah, the drawers don't help. They hide. Do you know what I feel bad about? What causes me that kind of uncomfortable guilt is when I'm in a bodega, a convenience store, or even one of these large grocery stores, and there's open refrigeration. Should
Mm.
I be feeling as bad as I do about that? Is that really horrible? Because it feels like it's really horrible.
Oh yeah, it's really horrible. And
Oh,
actually,
okay.
in a lot of places, I mean, many European countries have actually banned them. So you will find
Yeah.
everything behind glass now, and you have to open a door to get stuff. And retailers hate it. They say that it limits their sales because people somehow opening a glass door it provides enough of a barrier to prevent people from just grabbing stuff. And so they say it really puts a dent in their sales, and a dent that is big enough to overcome the energy savings of having the door.
Wow.
So,
That's amazing.
yeah, I know, again, people, we're
Yeah.
weird.
But of course, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at all of these sort of externalized costs, probably buying a lot of food on impulse is one of the quickest way to have food waste, to have food
So,
that you don't end up eating and that
I,
ends up going bad.
it undoubtedly even worse than the open grocery store refrigerated shelves. Yes, they're both
Uh,
bad, but together they're terribly bad.
yeah. So we talked about some of the good. We talked about this cold chain that didn't exist and some of the ways that our cities were very different than they are now because of the cold chain.
Yeah, and people's diets were very limited. In winter, I mean, there was a sort of period where stored root vegetables, people refer to it as the interminable coleslaw of winter. So, I mean, you were just if you ate what you had canned and preserved in the summer, but things things were a little unfun until the next harvest came around. So it definitely, and if you were poor and in the city, good luck to you. I mean, getting hold of fresh food and the nutrients you do need. So
Does refrigeration change the nutritional value of food? Like, how much of that is myth and how much of that is legitimate?
yeah, that's a great question and a very tough one. So I spent some time in the book trying to tease out the health impact of refrigeration because, people care about that and it is important. And it is much harder to untangle than you would think. And ultimately, it does seem as though much produce has lost um, its some nutrient value. So things will have lower levels of vitamins than they did in the past. That seems to scientifically be true, although hard to get a baseline on it because we haven't been measuring vitamins for very long. And we really don't have a baseline on any of the sort of things like phytonutrients because, I'm talking about things like, I don't know, lycopene in tomatoes, things like that where they are increasingly understood to have health benefits, but they're not something where there's a recommended daily allowance where the government says you have to get a certain amount for your health. So we really don't have measurements going back in history of how much lycopene was in our tomatoes. But with all those caveats, yes, it does seem that nutrient levels in produce especially have diminished. And the leading theory for why is because that produce has been bred for shippability. For the it's
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's got to be sturdy enough to stand up to the cold chain. And
Yeah.
the classic example of this, and it's something I spend a lot of time with in the book, is the tomato, which has entirely been bred for its ability to stand up to handling in the cold chain and refrigerated warehouses, and as a result tastes of nothing. And as it turns out, the very substances that make a tomato taste good also turn out to be linked to much higher levels of all the nutrients. So a healthier tomato is a tastier tomato, and that has been bred out of them for cold chain reasons. So yeah, I think you can. It's I don't know that all the science is there to make it a slam dunk case, but I ended up pretty convinced that breeding for these cold chain resilient foods has definitely diminished their nutrient content.
It's interesting because then I feel like if you broaden out your resolution that much more and you say, okay, the giving, right? The reduction in nutritional value, is it made up for? Is it more than made up for by the abundance now of access that we have? Is one a very nutritionally dense tomato, equivalent to the four less dense that I
Right.
now have access
And
to?
that you can have
That
all
question
year
gets
round in
complicated.
January, right?
Yeah.
But there I say to you, well, maybe if people were eating them, but they're not.
Right. Right.
And I think one of the reasons people don't eat that much fruit and vegetable is because the grocery store versions aren't that great. I mean, they're not craveable the way many of the snack foods that people eat are. Whereas I mean, this always makes me sound so ridiculous. So but I'm going to say it anyway. Really good produce is craveable. Like my own cherry tomatoes, when I pick them and they're hot from the sun, I cannot stop eating them. So I do feel like, okay, maybe the fact that our fruit and vegetables taste worse, it means that we also eat less of them. So sure, they're available, but we're not consuming them. So, that's another health implication.
Yeah, and I might argue that even if your cherry tomatoes are quite craveable, they probably, to most people, still don't hold a candle to the engineered craveable packaged foods that that we have produced, and that could be an also very large variable in why
Yeah,
consumption of those things has gone down. But you're right. I mean, all these little shifts are
it's
part
so
of a really
hard.
big algorithm.
That's the thing. And it ends up being really hard to tease out the overall impact on health. Because, for example, before we had year round fresh produce, there was more fermentation and more consumption of fermentation food. I mean, more consumption of fermented food. So,
Yeah.
what's the health impact of that? That, again, is very recent science. There isn't a recommended daily allowance of fermented food right now. There are a lot of health claims made for it, of course. So yeah, it's a tough
It's
one.
interesting, and I'm
Yeah,
curious too, you sort of the context in which you answered the question about the health effects of refrigeration were fascinating and probably much more, I think, informative, speaking to how food production and food evolution has changed, guided evolution, artificial selection has changed as a function of the cold chain. But also, I feel like there are people who literally believe that putting the thing in the refrigerator makes it bad versus leaving it on the counter.
well,
And to
okay,
me, that's a
they're
worrisome view. So
they're
I'm
n-
curious about
they're not
that.
totally wrong again in
Okay.
some cases. So, for
Okay.
example, I'll take the humble tomato again since we're since we're sticking with it. If you put that in the refrigerator for 4 days at below 55 degrees, the cold will alter its DNA in such a way that it loses the ability to produce flavor. So the flavor it already has is there, but it will not continue to ripen and develop flavor. So I do see why you might not. I mean, post harvest specialists, or the people who study produce post harvest, they call the fridge the stone fruit killing zone. It is not a happy place for your peach. And so I leave my peaches out on the counter. Now, on the other hand, meat, dairy, no, of course not. I mean, you can leave a little bit of butter out if you want to have it spreadable, but for actual sort of storage, no, of course not.
You know what's an interesting one is the way that we treat our eggs in the US
Eggs.
versus the UK. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that there is a huge difference in the refrigeration, in the necessity for refrigeration in the US versus the ability to leave them at room temperature in many European countries. It's not just that they put their eggs on the shelf and we put our eggs in the fridge. We have to put our eggs in the fridge in the US
Right,
because of
because we've
how we
washed off
treat
the
our eggs.
coating. Yeah.
Yes.
And the reason we wash off the coating that would allow this coating that is naturally there that would allow you to keep your eggs out of the cold chain, the reason we wash it off is because of fear of salmonella. But there is a vaccination for salmonella, and in the UK, chickens are required to be vaccinated against it. And so actually it's perfectly safe to keep your eggs unwashed and out of the fridge in the UK, and also perfectly safe to eat your raw cookie dough. Unexpected benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But the US hasn't made that mandatory, so that's a choice by the federal government that we are all living with.
It's an interesting cultural phenomenon where because something is how it has been since we've started to make memories, or because something is normative within a specific society, we start to develop an emotional valence, like you talked about earlier, of good versus bad, of right versus wrong. And those feelings run very, very deep.
Oh
And
my
so the
gosh.
way that I have a lot of European friends who will be eating food and then they're not done with the food. So they just put the plate in the fridge. And then later they take the plate out and they eat it again. Whereas in the US, a lot of people are mortified by putting food in the refrigerator that isn't in a container, like an airtight container.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating that these are cultural differences more than really public health differences, aren't they?
Oh, 100%. And it's so interesting. They are some of the most deeply thought questions in the world. So because I've been writing this book, I've had a Google alert on the words fridge, refrigerator, things like that for, again, a decade, just to see what people are talking about, make sure I don't miss any news, etc. And I will tell you that the primary thing to argue about on the internet is whether ketchup should be in the fridge. Should peanut butter be in the fridge?
Right. Yeah. Those are big fights, aren't they?
Why does my boyfriend put this in the fridge without a lid on it? Like you're saying, uncovered food
Mhm.
brings out a primitive horror.
Mhm.
So these are the things that people are passionate about.
And it's, I think that that goes to show something that's a really important component to sometimes conversations about technology, about that complicated, gosh, I really can't put my finger on the word I'm looking for right now, but that complicated web that is tied to quote unquote progress, where there is legitimate and observable data. There are scientific studies that sometimes say one thing, sometimes say another, but eventually we get to a point where there is some amount of consensus within scientific communities. And we can state probably quite comfortably certain facts. But then the interpretation of those facts and the right and the wrong and the good and the bad are so constructed by our cultures, by our societies, by our families, by our religions, by all of these different things, that it must have been really fascinating for you as you're digging deep into the history and the science of this process and this product, which is refrigeration, that it's a lot more gray than I think we probably assumed.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think if I maybe the one academic discipline, just to go back to the start, that I could have gone into full time is fridge anthropology, because there's everything there. But I will say one of the things that's so interesting is, I, I was when I was writing this book, I was fascinated to discover that when refrigeration was first introduced, there was this widespread suspicion of it. I mean, the Journal of the American Medical Association was like, ugh, this is not safe. It's, unhealthy. rabbis pronounced it unkosher. People were genuinely afraid that this technology was, these foods that it could have been harvested 6 months ago, but looked like they could have been harvested yesterday. What were these zombie foods? And it seems ridiculous to us now. And then I went to Rwanda to look at, they're trying to build a cold chain there, and I wanted to understand what that looked like. And, the folks there told me, oh, yeah, when the traders sell the leftover stuff that has been rejected for export from the one refrigerated warehouse in the city center, they have to leave it outside in the sun to warm it up before it goes on sale to local people, because the local people won't buy it if it's being refrigerated. They don't think it's good. And it's like these things they're very deep feelings about what is right and what is wrong. I mean, food, the raw and the cooked, this is kind of ways in which we define right and wrong, good and bad. And so, yeah, it's a topic about which there are there's some science and a lot of feelings.
Yeah, and so I'm curious how you navigated that as an author and somebody who did so much reporting and dug very deep into the history and into the science, and who, obviously is regularly talking about food on the podcast. And I can tell right now that probably some of our the feeling part of it, some of the opinions may be slightly different, you and me personally, about some of these approaches. Like I might take more of a skeptical, although I think you're probably pretty skeptical as well,
Mm-hmm.
but I might take more of a kind of hardline skeptical bent about certain things, and I might be more permissive or open about other things, and vice versa. So how do you navigate talking about something like this and not really showing your cards or saying, and my opinion is this, even though it's not really based on fact, it's just how I feel. Because
I mean,
there's so much room for that in a conversation like this.
I know, and it's really hard. And um, I'm not a scientist by training, and I really didn't want to come across as, being unscientific. And so actually I was really lucky. I got a Alfred P. Sloan Foundation grant for the book. And one of the things it funded was having science advisors read certain sections and give me feedback. And one of the sections I had 3 separate public health experts read was the section about health, because I just felt like, I don't want to mess this up. I have my own feelings and biases. There's a bunch of evidence out there, but what am I missing? What am I misinterpreting? What am I putting too much weight on because it's kind of how I feel? So,
Right. Am I cherry picking? What evidence is more solid? What evidence is a little bit wiggly? It's
yeah,
hard to know that. It's
it's
really
really
hard to
hard.
know that.
And I know there will be people who still think I got it wrong. It's tough. And yeah, I mean, I also feel like, I mean, is building a cold chain in sub-Saharan Africa wrong? Absolutely not. And the folks who are doing that are doing it with the absolute best of intentions. Is it important to look at what that does in terms of the environment, in terms of actually right now, what that does is that creates a way for farmers to export their produce to Europe. So they're just producing kind of cheaper vegetables for their former colonial overlords rather than, which brings in money, which is important. Money is necessary. But, it's also, is that the way to go with your economy? There are costs there too. So all of this, I just,
Yeah,
I,
it's really
it's
complicated.
so
And I see
complicated.
it a lot when we talk about cars and we talk about climate change, and there's sort of the privilege of the West saying, "We did it, we fucked everything up when we did it, so you probably shouldn't do it, we'll fuck things up." And it's like, "Wait a minute." Is a is maybe not a better approach, but is another approach to say, "Okay, we did it and we fucked a lot of things up. Are there lessons to be learned from how we fucked it up? Can we support a new vision for this incredibly economically empowering, um, technology that is a little kinder to the environment or kinder to the people who are utilizing it.
Totally. I mean, I was invited to speak at the first UN meeting of this new initiative, Global Cooling for All, that had its first meeting, I want to say like 5 or 6 years ago. And it just hit home for me. That's the reason to write this book. I mean, it took me long enough. I had to remind myself several times why I was doing it. But that's the reason to do it, is to really make this accounting that no one has made of refrigeration's costs and benefits, and really try and understand all the implications and the ways that it has shifted things for good and for bad and for a mixture of the two. Make that interesting, entertaining, and readable, sure, but also make it so that we can think about this and decide if we want to change it, and decide, folks in Rwanda can decide what they would like to do differently.
Right, right, because they have access to the education and the information, and the how we learn from past failures and how we learn from past successes. And what I what I love about that approach, I have to say here, as we sort of start to wind down the show, is I see these parallels that speak to me personally. I've been seeing patients all day today, and one of the themes that has been coming up over and over and over in a lot of psychotherapy sessions, because I work in a hospital and I'm very existentially oriented, is this concept of, you know, with the good coming the bad, or this concept of risk benefit, this concept of like nothing is that clean, nothing is all this way or all that way. And sometimes it being one way helps us see the underbelly and vice versa. This gray area, this complicated ambivalence, it is the way of the world. And being willing to venture into it and to grapple with it in a meaningful way, and to not go to this, I think, intellectually and emotionally dishonest place of, therefore we shall ban it, or yes, it shall take over the world. But finding that middle ground, which really allows for an honest accounting. It's it's an art that I don't think we often elevate, especially in American society. We love to be sure. We love for there to be a right answer and a wrong answer. And this is such a beautiful example of it's complicated.
I think complicated is interesting. Like that, I mean, that it's not only true, as you're saying, it's also interesting. And it's why things are interesting to me. But you're right. I mean, gosh, I think it's a lot easier to get yourself on an evening talk show and sell a lot of copies if I was like, refrigeration is killing us, and here's why.
Right, right.
But it's, yeah, this is where the truth is, this is where the beauty is, and this is where the fascination is, honestly.
Ugh. Well, gosh, I feel like I've learned so much, and yet there's so much more within the pages of this book. I can't thank you enough for sharing not just the incredible hard work that went into producing this, but also some of your insights with us here in this hour. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I enjoyed this conversation so much.
I'm glad. Everybody, the book is Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves by Nicola Twilley. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.